The easiest person to be cheated is an African man. Now, don't get me wrong. Understand me properly. The easiest scam to be purported in the world is the scam of religion. Let me explain it properly to you. You see, if you go into any part of the world and all books of science, you will see that if you go to Germany, the books of science and knowledge, psychology, the books that help you to think outside of the box is written in German. If you go to China, the book of science, knowledge that helps you to think and really be able to be a better human being is written in China. The Chinese man teaches their child in Chinese. The German man teaches his child in German. The English man teaches his own child in English. The Indian man teaches his child in India. But if you come to Africa, the African man is busy wanting to teach his child in English. If you go to the schools in Africa, in the schools and the libraries in Africa, all the books in the schools that is of science is all written in English. But if you go all over Africa, you will see that the Bible is translated practically into all the languages in Africa. Tell me if that is not a purported scam. When the man that was a very big tyrant, I've forgotten his name right now because it just skipped my mind. The man that was a very big tyrant actually was a big terrorist that came to Africa and took slaves and went on board the ship and went to sell them across the ocean. When that man made a lot of money, he was so famous and so wealthy with the wealth that he made that the Queen of England was so happy with him that she commissioned a ship for him to come back to Africa and pick more slaves. He picked more slaves, and guess what is the name of the ship? Jesus. He picked more slaves and took those people across the ocean. While they were on top of the ocean going, many of them were pregnant, and they threw some of these pregnant women aboard the ship because they were too weak to continue the journey, to be fed to the sharks. Tell me what kind of offense or sin is graver than that. But that man has made a lot of wealth that his generation is enjoying, even though that wealth is made from crime. But an African man is being taught with the Bible that the reason why you are not being successful is because of your ancestors. Your ancestors were the one that were making you, that are making you unsuccessful. So the African man or the African woman is busy 24 hours in the
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Africans, depending on where you're watching from. I greet you. Shalom. I hope you're doing fine where you are. Now, you as an African, are you proud of who you are? Are you proud of where you were born? Many people are born Africans, but they don't like being associated with the concept of being called an African. Even we've realized that many African Americans, or rather Black Americans, do not want to be called African Americans. Even some countries in Africa don't want to be called African countries. Yeah. We saw this with Morocco. We saw this with some other countries, such as the ones we have in the north. Countries like Egypt, countries like Algeria, countries like Libya. Some of these countries do not like being associated with black. And this is a problem. And here is why. You see, a black person is a man who has faced slavery and colonialism. I believe you already know this. But maybe what you might not know fully is the extent to which this colonialism and slavery had caused a lot of post-traumatic slavery disorder, or rather post-traumatic colonialism disorder to the minds of people. The people who were colonized believed they were always inferior. The people who were enslaved the same way, we were made to believe that our culture was weak, our culture was satanic, our culture was very, very bad. We had not education of ourselves. We were primitive. Think of all the negative things. We were told all that by the white person who came to colonize us. So as a result, we grew up knowing that our ways are bad, the white man's ways are good, And this is why you will find that in Africa, we have languages being taught. In Africa, we have national languages as English. It is only in Tanzania that you find the national language is Swahili. And many Africans, criticize Tanzania for that. They say that in Tanzania, people are not learned because they teach in African language. Swahili is an African language, even though it borrows some words from Asia. But the very idea that Tanzania uses its national language is an idea that it takes pride in its Africanicity. It takes pride in Pan-Africanism. It takes pride in its own culture and traditions. You understand? This is one thing that I love about Tanzania. So there is a video I want us to watch before I go further. There's a video about a man deeply explaining the concept and why Africans are quick to throw what they have in order to get what is outside. We believe that what we have is not enough, or rather it's too little, or something we ought not to have, and we should take something from another person. The Chinese have Confucius institutes in Africa to spread their Chinese traditions. The Koreans have King Sol. There is some would call King something in Korean. I did some Korean while I was doing my undergraduate. Japanese have the same. People from Hungary have the same. Name it all. They have the same in their own countries. But in Africa, outside Africa, we don't have these institutes that are there to promote our culture. We don't have them. It's not like we can't have them. We choose not to have them. Now, I want us to listen to this gentleman, and then I shall catch up with you where we shall also have a deep critical analysis by the end of the video. Let's dive in.
The easiest person to be cheated is an African man. Now, don't get me wrong. Understand me properly. The easiest scam to be purported in the world is the scam of religion. Let me explain it properly to you. You see, if you go into any part of the world and all books of science, you will see that if you go to Germany, the books of science and knowledge, psychology, the books that help you to think outside of the box is written in German. If you go to China, the book of science, knowledge that helps you to think and really be able to be a better human being is written in China. The Chinese man teaches their child in Chinese. The German man teaches his child in German. The English man teaches his own child in English. The Indian man teaches his child in India. But if you come to Africa, the African man is busy wanting to teach his child in English. If you go to the schools in Africa, in the schools and the libraries in Africa, all the books in the schools that is of science is all written in English. But if you go all over Africa, you will see that the Bible is translated practically into all the languages in Africa. Tell me if that is not a purported scam. When the man that was a very big tyrant, I've forgotten his name right now because it just skipped my mind. The man that was a very big tyrant actually was a big terrorist that came to Africa and took slaves and went on board the ship and went to sell them across the ocean. When that man made a lot of money, he was so famous and so wealthy with the wealth that he made that the Queen of England was so happy with him that she commissioned a ship for him to come back to Africa and pick more slaves. He picked more slaves, and guess what is the name of the ship? Jesus. He picked more slaves and took those people across the ocean. While they were on top of the ocean going, many of them were pregnant, and they threw some of these pregnant women aboard the ship because they were too weak to continue the journey, to be fed to the sharks. Tell me what kind of offense or sin is graver than that. But that man has made a lot of wealth that his generation is enjoying, even though that wealth is made from crime. But an African man is being taught with the Bible that the reason why you're not being successful is because of your ancestors. Your ancestors were the one that were making you, that are making you unsuccessful. So the African man or the African woman is busy 24 hours in the church trying to cast and bind his ancestors. Why the man and the ancestors of the man that purported the biggest crime that happened in Africa are there enjoying? You can never see a white man blaming his ancestors to be responsible for his problem, but you will always see an African man condemning his ancestors to be responsible for his problem. An African man goes to America to work, he's killed. An African man goes to Germany to work, he works in the toilet because that is what he deserves. Yes, if you're an African man or an African woman that is working in the toilet, cleaning the toilet, and being spat upon and cleaning the piss of people, that is what you deserve. Why? Because you have given the middle finger to your ancestors. A tree that forgets, and a river that forgets its source dries off. A tree that forgets its root dries off. A man that criticizes his ancestors, the best kind of punishment that is meant for him is what? humiliation. So if you are in any of these countries receiving humiliation, you deserve it, because what? You have cut off your lineage, you have cut off and disregard and disrespected your ancestors, and you are thinking that the blessing is going to come to you. It is not going to come to you. It is not going to come to you. If you go to America to want to study, or you go to German to want to study, you will study in the language of the Germans. The books of knowledge, the books of science is written in the language of the Germans. You go to China, it is the same thing. You go to India, it is the same thing. You go to Switzerland, it is the same thing. You go to anywhere in the European country, you have to learn in their country. But if you come to Africa, you want to study, the books of knowledge in Africa is written in English. It is never, there is no book of knowledge, biology, chemistry, that is translated in an African language. Show me one. You can never find one. But you will find the Bible translated in all languages of Africa. Why? Because it is a big scam, and it is the easiest way to do what? To take advantage of the people and put them in shackles so that you can continue doing what? Milking them. It is time for you to wake up. It is time for you to wake up. Goodbye.
Now, since this individual is speaking about African spirituality and erosion of Africanism or African practices by the colonizers and the enslaver, here is a research I've done about this video. African spirituality at first. Now, this spirituality of Africanism is deeply rooted in Africa's diverse cultures. It is complex and multifaceted belief system that emphasizes the interconnectedness of all beings, the importance of nature, ancestors, and the spiritual forces that govern the universe. It is characterized by a holistic worldview, where in every aspect of life, physical, mental, social, and spiritual interacts. You know, these domains come together, and these domains, as they come together, they influence each other. They influence the culture we live in. You understand? However, what happened is that the arrival of the European colonizers in Africa in the late 15th century and the subsequent centuries of colonization had led to the profound erosion of these spiritual traditions. Colonization not only affected Africans, it not only disrupted our African social and political structures, but also it imposed foreign religious, cultural, and spiritual frameworks that undermine indigenous African belief system. The impact of colonization on African spirituality was profound, contributing to the marginalization of indigenous practices, the distortion of African identities, and the gradual dismantling of cultural cohesion. You know, this is how much colonization did. It dismantled the structures we had. You know, it brought PTSD to us. Now, let's look at the foundation of African spirituality according to my research. African spirituality is not monolithic, whereby you find it is one being who is the creator, and he is being worshipped by his creations. You get it? Now, African religion is not monolithic. It is polyolithic. Many gods, poly, yeah. It varies widely across the continent, with different ethnic groups and religions practicing their own spiritual belief. Despite these differences, several common features define African spiritual traditions. Central to these practices is the reverence for ancestors. Ancestors are believed to maintain an active role in the lives of their descendants, offering guidance, protection, and blessings. African spiritual practices are often centered around rituals, you know, ceremonies and communal activities that seek to maintain harmony between the living and the spiritual world. You get it? Nature also plays a central role in African spirituality. Many African religions view the world as a sacred, where the elements, earth, water, fire, and air are seen as a manifestation of divine forces. The belief in the spiritual significance of animals, plants, and landscape is also a significant aspect of African spirituality. Furthermore, many African belief systems hold that spiritual forces, often referred to as gods or deities, govern the universe, ensuring balance and order. These deities are often associated with particular natural phenomena, such as thunder, rain, fertility, or the sun. In many African societies, the boundaries between the spiritual and the physical world, are fluid. Healing, both physical and spiritual, is deeply integrated into the religious practices, with healers, diviners, and shamans playing crucial roles in maintaining community well-being. Religion and spirituality are therefore deeply embedded in everyday life, guiding morals and ethical behavior, social relations, and individual growth. How did colonialism bring about the dismantling of African spirituality? Now, after discussing all that, and we've known the mechanics and the philosophy behind African spirituality, how then did colonization dismantle this system of belief? Because as from the research, this is not an easy thing to dismantle, But how comes colonization was successful in doing this? Here is why. The arrival of European colonizers, beginning with the Portuguese in the 15th century, brought profound changes to Africa, including the systemic erosion of African spirituality. The colonizers viewed Africans' belief system as primitive and pagan, believing that they needed to be replaced with Christianity, which they saw as a more civilized religion. This view was embedded in the colonial ideology, which sought to impose European norms and values on the colonized people. Colonial powers such as British, French, and Portuguese introduced Christianity as the official religion in territories they controlled. Missionaries arrived alongside colonizers, establishing churches, schools, and hospitals to spread Christian teachings. These missionaries often worked to suppress African spiritual practices by labeling them as evil or demonic. Indigenous religious ceremonies and rituals were outlawed, and those who continued to practice African spirituality were often persecuted. In many religions, African religious leaders such as priests, shamans, and diviners were stigmatized, arrested, or executed, and their sacred sites were destroyed or desecrated. Moreover, the European concept of religion, which was often separate from daily life and closely tied to doctrinal teachings, clashed with the more integrated and communal nature of African spirituality. African religious practices, which were oral and dynamic, were dismissed as unorganized or unsophisticated. The emphasis on individual salvation in Christianity also contrasted with the collective focus of African spirituality, which prioritized community welfare and ancestral connections. What about the cultural and psychological displacement on the black people? The erosion of African spirituality was not just an intellectual or religious conflict. It also led to the cultural and psychological displacement. The colonial experience was one of the profound alienation where Africans, or rather African people, were often forced to abandon their religious practices, languages, and cultural norms. Colonizers worked to replace indigenous languages with European languages, further keep putting some distance, between Africans and their spirituality and cultural heritage. Education from the West also played a pivotal role in this process. Missionary schools became the primary centers for learning, where African children were taught European languages, history, and religious beliefs while being discouraged from seeking their native languages or practicing their ancestral faith. Through this process, African spirituality was gradually displaced, and many Africans began to internalize the view that their traditions were inferior or nothing or wrong. This led to a loss of confidence in their cultural practices and contributed to the decline of indigenous spiritual systems. The psychological trauma caused by this cultural erasure is still felt today in many African countries. The impact of colonialism led to a sense of shame about African identity, with many people distancing themselves from their spiritual heritage. This cultural amnesia was further compounded by the disintegration of African social structures, as colonization often disrupted tribal leadership, family units, and community bonds. You know, of course, they had to be met with resistance. But what is this resistance? We had resistance, and also we had revitalization. Despite the significant erosion of African spirituality, indigenous religious practices have not disappeared entirely. Throughout the colonial era, many Africans resisted imposition of European religious beliefs, continuing to practice their faith in secret or adopting it in the face of their colonial repression. In some instances, African spiritual traditions were syncretized with Christianity, creating new religious forms that maintained elements of indigenous beliefs while adapting Christian symbols and rituals. So they brought Christianity and Africanism together, is what I'm getting. This blending of tradition can be seen in the development of African independent churches, such as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which sought to assert an African identity within Christianity, or in the creation of new religious movements that fused African and Christian elements together. In recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in African spirituality. Across the continent, there has been a growing movement to reclaim indigenous belief system, practices, and rituals as part of a broader effort to connect with Africa's cultural heritage. You know, many Africans are seeking to restore their spiritual traditions, which have been overshadowed by centuries of colonialism, and reassert their spiritual and cultural practices in a post-colonial world. To conclude, the impact of colonization on African spirituality was devastating, leading to the near destruction of many indigenous religious practices. The imposition of Christianity, the suppression of African spiritual leaders, and the marginalization of indigenous cultures contributed to a loss of spiritual and cultural identity for many African people. However, despite the challenges posed by colonialism, African spirituality has not been eradicated. You know, today there is a growing movement to retrieve and protect these sacred traditions. As Africans reclaim their spiritual heritage and seek to heal the wounds caused by the centuries of colonial rule, the restoration of African spirituality is not only a religious or cultural act, but also an essential step in an ongoing process of decolonization, healing, and self-empowerment. Yep. This one was a very powerful video, guys, because that guy had a very strong claim that an African is someone who is easy to deceive. But why is he easy to deceive? He is easy to deceive because of the PTSD, post-traumatic slavery disorder, or post-traumatic slavery syndrome, as placed by Dr. Joy DeGray. I did a video on Dr. Joy DeGray. She explains clearly what is PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome, how it affects people up to date, you know. So Africans don't just act like that. It is the suffering we've passed through that causes us to experience all this. But just because we experienced this before does not mean that we will always stick to that each day. There is a change that is coming, and there is a change that one time we are promised that everything is going to be okay. You know, we can't always every now and then we keep on complaining of these people. There is a time when we sit back as Black people, we look back and say, that is done, let's focus on the future. And the future involves decolonization. So I hope you get enlightened by this video, and if you do, kindly subscribe. I will so much appreciate, and see you in the next one.